The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech. In the United States, all Americans have a right to free speech, but not all citizens use those rights in a positive way. While free speech allows for protest and dissent, it also allows for racism. For example, Asian stereotypes have long plagued this country. Many people who live in areas that have little to no Asian population do not know what Asian Americans are actually like, which leads them to ignorantly believe in false stereotypes. But with free speech, Asians should be able to show that those stereotypes aren't true, right? Well, sort of. Asian American stereotypes originated from the 19th century, in which Chinese immigrants were faced with racism in the West. Because of economic tensions, labor unrest, and racial hostility, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed, banning Chinese immigration for 10 years. Discrimination against Asians continued into the 20th century, where Asians were faced with even more racism because of the Pearl Harbor bombing. This stigma against Asian Americans ended up causing many people's perception of them to be stereotypical, which bled into the film industry. For most of its history, Asian Americans have been relegated to the background. Even when they were in a leading role, it was a martial arts movie. The roles they were limited to did nothing but further stereotypes, that they were always the Asian people, and never the Asian people. Asians have been on screen since the beginning of Hollywood's history, yet it wasn't until the 1990s that true representation of Asian stories began to arrive. During this decade, Asian creators had a responsibility to use their right to free speech to push for creative freedom that they were not being given, so that they could create films and TV shows that defy stereotypes and increase true representation by telling their stories to end the age of Asian stereotypes in Western media. During the silent film era, there was little racial diversity in the films being released. Characters, regardless of their ethnicity, were played by white actors or actresses. But starting in the 20th century, there were actually a few Asian actors, Sesue Hayakawa and Anime Wong. They were essentially the first examples of any Asian representation in Hollywood films, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was good representation. While Sesue Hayakawa found success acting in romantic films, he ended up leaving the industry for a period because he kept getting typecast as Oriental villains or lovers. Anime Wong found success in silent films as well, but in 1935, she lost her role to a white actress, Louise Rayner, for the film The Good Earth, and Rayner ended up winning an Oscar for that role that she played in Yellowface. So while they were appearing in films, they never played more than an exotic character, unless that exotic character was played by a white person in makeup. A classic example of this is in 1961's Breakfast at Tiffany's. Mickey Rooney played a stereotypical buck-toothed Japanese man with an offensive accent, which executive director of the Park Conservancy reduced to a product of the times. But there were some glimmers of hope. In the late 1960s, Bruce Lee rose to fame as a charming and charismatic actor with incredible martial arts skills. Asian children finally had someone to look up to that wasn't an offensive stereotype. They had someone to look up to that played heroes. From here on out until the 1990s, Asians were in more movies than ever, but over and over they were always just the same types of character. If they were starring in a film, it was more than likely a martial arts movie. And if they weren't starring, then they were a side character defined by their race. Those stereotypes severely impacted some actors' careers, like Ke-Huy Quan, who played Short Round in The Temple of Doom and Data in The Goonies. He essentially disappeared after those two roles because no one would hire him for anything outside of the stereotypical Asian roles. And that was the main issue with representation in the late 20th century. All Asian children had to look up to were roles that reduced Asian people to nothing but stereotypes. Asian kids either had to look up to a kung fu guy like Bruce Lee, hypersexualized female fatales, or they had to settle for sidekicks. Asian representation was purely stereotypical. And that was the case until, in 1993, The Joy Luck Club was released, a film starring Asians that was actually about their life stories. Adapted from the novel of the same name, the film was monumental for Asian representation. The film follows a group of aging immigrant Chinese women who tell their life stories whilst playing mahjong. Through their stories, the audience get to see the familial history of these women and the lives they led. They weren't reduced to side characters or the dragon woman stereotype. They were full characters with human stories. Along with being successfully financially, people loved the film. Daniel Jung, a Korean-American writer, explained how it felt watching the film when he was a kid. My parents and I watched the movie a few months later, and for the first time, I saw people who looked like me, speaking without an Asian accent, and even more jarring, not portrayed as a kung fu fighter, seductive temptress, or emasculated comic relief. They went to school, had piano recitals, and competed in chess tournaments, but they did so with a distinct Asian Americanness. Asian Americans were incredibly happy to finally watch a movie that showed them as people, with their own distinct struggles that are unique to Asian Americans and Asians, but aren't strictly the stereotypes that had plagued the silver screen for so long. But despite this overwhelming success, for the next 2 decades, Asian representation stayed in an odd middle ground. There were films, such as In the Mood for Love, that continued to portray Asians as actual human beings with unique struggles, but there were still examples of bad representation. Korean-American comedian Margaret Cho got her own sitcom titled All-American Girl, which was the first major sitcom in the US to star an all-Asian cast. It would have been monumental at the time to have a good weekly sitcom starring Asians, but unfortunately, Cho didn't have creative control, so the show leaned into stereotypes for its humor, and behind the scenes, she was criticized by the producers for her weight and how Asian she was. As time went on, there continued to be borderline racist characters in Western media. In Disney's extremely popular 2003 film, Freaky Friday, there is an Asian character who speaks Chinese to the two leads. The main character thinks that the Chinese woman cursed them and calls it
some strange Asian voodoo.
This is how Asian representation was for a while. There was the occasional example of good representation, like Ang Lee's Life of Pi or Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, but Asians were still largely reduced to background and stereotypical roles. But regardless of these stereotypes, the 1990s and very early 2000s planted a seed in the industry. Films like The Joy Luck Club proved that you could tell real human Asian stories and still find financial success without racist stereotypes. And though it took a while longer, the effects of films like that are now felt across the industry. In the past decade, Asian American representation has gotten better than it has ever been. It all started when in 2015, Taiwanese American writer Eddie Huang's memoir, Fresh Off the Boat, was adapted into a sitcom. People across the country sat down on their couches and turned their TVs to ABC, and began watching the first sitcom since the 1990s that had an all-Asian cast.
Okay, what is this white people lunch? What is the store so excited about?
This is where Lunchables live, Mom.
This scene showed something that many Asian Americans can relate to. Eddie was told that his Chinese food smelled bad at lunch and made fun of for that. In an attempt to fit in, he asked his mom for white people food. The scene was funny and relatable without being completely stereotypical. The representation was monumental at the time, but the studio's goals with it were neutered. For the studio, simply having a sitcom with some Asian culture in it was enough, and as long as their main demographic, white Americans, were okay with it, that was enough. In a conversation with his producer, Melvin, Huang was faced with the truth of the show. We tested the show, and there may or may not be a handful of butthurt white people. Success! Maybe, but listen, white people keep you on the air. They have to feel included. If people understand our perspective, they won't be offended. The show had stories that nearly every Asian American can relate to, like being told your food smells by other kids or being called a slur.
It's my turn, chink!
But the studio had to make sure that there wasn't too much Asianness or else their main demographic would feel left out. But despite this, for many, it was enough to have a weekly sitcom that had elements of their culture without being completely offensive or 100% stereotypical. But it only stayed this way for a little longer, until Warner Bros. Released John M. Chu's Crazy Rich Asians in 2018. The film had a story that, outside of all the glitz and the glamour, was relatable for Asian Americans. Learning about a side of yourself that you never really knew, and visiting the country that your family resided in for hundreds of years. And this was when the tables finally started to turn. The Farewell told the story of a Chinese American woman going to China to be with her sick grandmother and was a critical and box office success. Minari told the story of a Korean American family trying to make a life on a farm and all the struggles that come with that. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings was the first Marvel superhero film to star an Asian actor and became one of the highest grossing films of that year. Past Lives told the story of two childhood sweethearts reuniting after one of them emigrated from South Korea. American Born Chinese, Joyride, Interior Chinatown, Beef, Everything Everywhere All at Once placed Asian struggles in a sci-fi story and made numerous historical achievements, with the first Asian actors to win Best Supporting Actor, Best Actress, and is one of the few films in history to win Best Picture with an all-Asian cast. American audiences are also adjusted to seeing Asian stories without feeling left out. Bong Joon-ho's entirely Korean language Parasite was a box office success in the US and became the first foreign and Asian film to win Best Picture at the Oscars.
Parasite.
And not to mention Squid Game, a Korean TV show which became Netflix's highest watched piece of media ever, with over 2.2 billion hours watched, and it became a cultural phenomenon. Asian American stories are finally being told for what they truly are. The United States history is filled with racism against minorities. They face discrimination not only in daily life but in films as well. Along with Asian Americans' stereotypical representation in Hollywood, Black, Hispanic, and other minority groups were not getting real representation of their cultures and peoples. But since the dawn of the 21st century, they've all begun to tell their stories. Western media has for so long been dominated by white culture, but now is incredibly diverse in the communities it represents. There are African American stories being told, Hispanic American stories being told, Asian American stories being told. For so long, Asian Americans have been reduced to the model minority stereotype. The model minority stereotype reduced Asians to always being the doctors and the lawyers and being polite when faced with casual racism. But as any Asian American knows, they are much more than that. They have unique struggles and lives, unique histories and families, unique culture and personalities. Asians are human beings, and with their right to free speech, they finally, after so much fighting, gain creative control to tell their true stories and rid themselves of the stereotypes that they've so long been reduced to. But they're not going to be reduced anymore. The age of Asian stereotypes in Western media is over.